folks? Welcome back to CFB Picks. Today we're previewing the upcoming Rose Bowl game between Penn State and Utah. Before we dive into this one, and we're going to dive into it a bit more than a lot of other sports talk shows have been, kind of giving this game, maybe just a 4 or 5 minute preview. We're going to really dive into this one here, but before we do, place in the comments what you think the score is going to be. And with that being said, we'll dive into this one here. Before we really dive into this one, I think it's notable to discuss some of the opt-outs on both sides here. For Utah, we have Dalton Kincaid, the tight end, and Clark Phillips, the cornerback, both opting out for the NFL draft. Penn State has a few more opt-outs, several transfers, but among their starters, they'll be missing Parker Washington and Joey Porter Jr. as they prepare for the NFL draft. So getting into the Utah side of things, it's a bit surprising, at least in my opinion, that their offense is actually pretty good this year, ranking 18th. They've looked a bit kind of sputtery at times. They run the ball pretty well, and Rising, I think, at least in my opinion, is an underrated quarterback. The guy shows up for big games, and he makes big plays when he needs to. I think that's the very least we can say about him. At best, he's pretty consistent and really thrives in the Utah's offensive scheme. Their defense is pretty good as well, and that's they have elite guys in the back end of things, such as Clark Phillips, who though will be missing this game, and they have good line play as well. Their strength of schedule is 60th, which I think is going to be notable in this game. Also, as we'll get into when we break down Utah's schedule, they haven't faced a lot of great defenses this year, which I think is going to be interesting, going into, a game against a pretty darn good defensive team, Penn State. Their yards per rush is actually tied for 5th in the country at 5.5 yards per attempt, and their passing is tied for 41st in the country. Certainly, a good passing attack, but not elite by any standards. One thing that I think is going to hurt Utah potentially in this game, or is at least something that can hurt them, is their passing defense, which only ranks tied for 87th. And the rushing defense, as I said before, it's pretty good, kind of as I alluded to with their line play. It's tied for 37th. A good statistic, but by no means an elite one. When you dive into additional statistics, Utah's putting up 40 points per game. So, despite having maybe a bit of a sputtering passing game, there's been a few games this year where, they've only, put up, 17 points, in the case of Oregon. But apart from that, they've done pretty well. 26 against Florida is good, not great. But, they have, a pretty good passing attack and offense overall that, gets them to that pretty high points per game average. Their explosiveness is pretty average at a .084. A really good explosiveness is anything above a 0.9 from typically what I've seen this year in the games I've previewed. Their play calling, because I think it's going to be a factor in this game, is they're rushing the ball about 40 times a game and they're passing about 31. They're going in against a pretty good Penn State rush defense, or at least they have been in most games. So I think it's going to be interesting to see if they stick with that strategy. I expect them to. They have the line play, I think, to keep up even with really good rush defenses like Penn State's. But it's something interesting to watch, especially going into this game. So getting into Utah's schedule, as I mentioned before, so they've been pretty dominant in their schedule, especially in conference play. They have the early loss to Florida when, Florida was playing good football. I don't really knock them for that. The game I do think that's a bit interesting, though, is the 42-16 win against Oregon State. And, you might look at it and say, hey, this is a blowout. But what's notable in this game is that's the only top 50, depending on where you get your rankings, that is. But where I get mine is the only top 50 defense they've faced. Utah played a really good game, especially on the defensive side. They only gave up 38 rushing yards. They did give up 246 through the air, though. But against this defense, they still rushed the ball for 162 yards, and then Rising had 199 yards passing with an 8-yard attempt average. What is notable, apart from the offensive and defensive statistics, is Utah did win the turnover ratio 4-0. So I think this game was actually, or at least could have been, a lot closer than the score suggests. So going into this game against Penn State, you got to kind of ask yourself, what is 4 turnovers in your favor in the margin, going to do? And, we'll never know from that game. It looks like, Utah was at least able to capitalize on that. But I think that game could have been a lot closer, 1 or 2 more scores in Oregon's favor, or Oregon State, rather's favor. Really could have swung things in the other direction. So speaking of Oregon, that's the next game we're going to look at. The reason we're looking at it is this is the second best defense Utah's faced. By no means a good defense, don't get me wrong. But in this game, offensively, Utah has 170 yards passed for, only 36 yards rushing in their total. Their defense gave up 287 yards against passing. I mean, to a good quarterback, though, in Nick's credit, he went 7.8 yards per attempt in that game. And Utah did actually lose the turnover rate, battle in that one, 3-1. So, I mean, not a great day in terms of the turnover for Utah, but I think the point is there that this Utah defense, especially when it comes to passing, can be exploited, at least by good quarterbacks. So I think that's something to watch as they play against Penn State. Typically their rush defense seems to hold up. Their rushing attack still seems to put up decent numbers, especially in the case of Oregon State. But I think when they face, good passing defenses, and we'll discuss if Penn State even is a good, or rather offense, but when they play a good passing offense, we'll see if that actually holds up in the case of Penn State. So getting into Penn State, they currently have the 32nd best offense in the country in total yards. Not too surprising, as I think they're, say what you will about their passing offense, it ranks 53rd in the country, but I think it's been a lot better than previous years, at least with Clifford under center. Maybe not a lot better, but I think the play calling has helped it out this year, especially compared to last year and his previous years starting for them. The yards against per game, as I said before, Penn State's defense ranks 12th in the country. I think it's notable that the best defense so far that Utah has faced ranks 24th in Oregon State, which we just talked about. The strength of schedule is 17th toughest in the country. That's a good bit better in terms of difficulty than Utah's. Yards per rush is a 4.8. Surprising that they're, at least to me, that they're, a decent clip behind Utah, but nonetheless still a good passing attack. And then looking at their passing defense, it ties for 4th in the country. It's going to be interesting to see if that holds up in this game with Parker Washington, their number 1 receiver, opting out this game. And their yards against per rush, rushing defense is tied for 8th in the country. I think it's going to be interesting to see, too, how Utah responds to that, with their game plan for this one. Getting into Penn State's schedule, so the games I chose to break down for this one was first Michigan, not to drag, Penn State for that loss, but because I think it's relevant as they're going to be facing what, the statistics suggest to be a rush-heavy offense from Utah just based on their play calling and their production to date. Versus Michigan, Penn State, pretty bad day on offense, 157 yards passing and only 111 yards rushing. Defensively, terrible day against the run, giving up 418 yards, and that's just against the rush, not for the whole game. But Clifford, he did all right against a good passing defense. All right might be pushing it, but 6.3 yards per attempt is, it moves the ball, but is by no means, what you're shooting for or a good number. It's, I'd say average to subpar. Against Minnesota, Penn State didn't face the full Minnesota game. They didn't, have Tanner Morgan playing that game. Went up against a first-time starter, backup from Minnesota, who I thought was actually pretty good in that one. Offensively, 175 yards for rushing, and then Clifford threw the ball for 295 yards through the air. And then Aller came in late and added a few more yards to that. What I think is notable, though, is Penn State's defensive performance rushing. So they gave up 165 on the ground. Now, I don't know if Ibrahim from Minnesota was 100% in that game, but he certainly looked to be, pretty good, or at least he was effective until the game, kind of got out of hand there. And that's a good bit worse than their average. Penn State's given up usually 105 yards on the ground, which, is tough to maintain, especially against, good backs. But nonetheless, the point is that their rush defense, at least in most cases, especially with the exception of Michigan, is holding up against, higher level, at least rushing attacks. And Minnesota, they were a decent team this year. By no means great, but Penn State can definitely hold a good back, to a limited number of yards, which I think is going to be a big point in this game. So getting into the picks, right now I have this picked at 28-24 for Utah. The model has this a heck of a lot closer, though. It has Utah just ahead of Penn State. And when I say just, I mean it's 27.79 to 27.61. So about as close to a, 50-50, difference as you can get. When you break it down the numbers, Penn State's actually projected to have the better rushing defense. And then Utah is expected to have a slightly better passing offense at 6.81 to 6.55 yards per attempt. In Vegas right now, they have Utah at a -2.5 favorite and a 52.5 over/under. Getting into some additional statistics from the model. So the rush yards for per play, despite Utah having a pretty decent better average to date, the model likes Penn State to do a little bit better rushing at 2.82 to 2.63 for Utah. And then for the passing offense, I think it's interesting that the model actually likes Penn State too in this one at 4.74 and Utah at 4.68 yards per attempt. And then so it looks like, by the model stats, or it leads one to think that Penn State's actually at a slight advantage offensively. But I think what the model's also seeing here is, Utah, they're just better at executing a passing game plan, and I think it really comes down to quarterback play. As I said before, I think Clifford, can thrive in Penn State's scheme at times. When you roll him out, when you get him, kind of play him as a more mobile quarterback, just have him sit in the pocket and pass. I think their offense, works pretty well and can, really open up a passing game. On the other hand, though, I think what Utah does with Rising is just a lot better. The guy shows up for big games. His numbers have been better all year, and I think, there's something to say about, and while both these guys have been around a while, I think there's something to say with a guy who just seems to maybe fit better in a scheme or is maybe just a bit more of a refined passer. But I think that's what the difference comes down to, and that's why I'm picking Utah in this one. I expect this game to be a defensive battle on the lines. I think the question is that, while on paper Penn State has a clear advantage in the passing game, I'm skeptical if they can actually, take advantage of that. And what I'm talking about specifically is their huge advantage they have in quality of, pass defense. So at the end of the day, Penn State's path to victory is, can they throw the ball? Can they take advantage of a Utah defense that already isn't very good with their top player opting out? Granted, Penn State's also out their top receiver. But if you're Penn State, that's how I think you win this game. And the problem with that is I don't think this team is really kind of tooled that way to operate, on a pass-heavy offense. All season what they've done is, they'll, use a rushing attack with, kind of that dual-headed monster back, if you will, with Singleton and Allen, and then that'll open up the passing play. It gets their tight ends open. It gets their receivers open. And I think in this game, I just don't know that that's going to happen. I think Penn State's going to have to, get their yards through the air, and that the rushing game is just going to kind of have to, be something that, keeps their play calling interesting, or, at least, moves the ball with some consistency, or at least that's what Penn State would hope in this one. So as I said before, I think this is really going to be a grinded out game. I think it's going to be pretty low scoring. I think that under-over predicted by Vegas is right on. And I think that at the end of the day, this game is really a pick 'em. I think the reason for the spread and the reason why I picked Utah to win this is I just have more faith in Rising executing his game plan than Penn State and Clifford executing theirs. I also think that Whittingham's play calling this year, just watching the games he's managed, I mean, say what you will about Utah's team and their level of talent. I know Penn State's beat them in the kind of recruiting aspect of the game for a while, but with Whittingham just does really good things with what he has. I think he's a great game time coach, for lack of a better way to put it. And I think their offensive, play calling is just a lot better than Penn State's. And don't get me wrong, Penn State's offensive play calling I think has come a long way this year. I just don't think Franklin is quite the game manager that Whittingham is. And I'm not trying to say that's a knock him. I think Whittingham is one of the most grossly underrated game time coaches out there, especially at the Power 5 level. So that's where I think that kind of tips the scale in this game, is I think play calling is a part of it. And I also think, Utah's ability to be more of a two-way offense, to really kind of execute their passing game. If their run game doesn't work, I just have a higher level of confidence in them doing that than Penn State. But as I alluded to before, this game is a pick-em because I think Penn State definitely has a very clear path to victory, and that's, throwing the ball through the air. I just think without their top receiver and Clifford's inconsistency and their ability to really leverage, or really execute a pass-heavy game plan throughout the year, it's just not something they've done. So I think at the end of the day, you have to question, come bowl game against, a pretty darn good defense, are they going to be able to do that? And I'm just not sure that they can. So with that being said, put your picks in the comments, and happy bowl season.